Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I get off the train and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, greetings, listeners. It is a lovely day in suburban Chicago. The sun is shining. It's warm. I've got my hoodie in my backpack and my long sleeves are rolled up. It's a lovely day for some walking back from work and some podcasting. I hope that it's a lovely day where you are right now. This is that sweet spot in Chicago where the weather is nice but not too hot. Well, it's because it's spring. It's the time when a game designer's habits turn to new games. Well, not really. It's rather that the pace of my work has changed a bit, and I actually have some room to give attention to my game designs. And so we've been really pushing hard on our train game, In the Loop. In the Loop is a tile-based train game where you are building the Chicago Elevated Railway system. And we are at the point we've been playing it and testing it for a couple years now. It's pretty much rules locked. We've kind of found, or at least it's gameplay locked. And now we're working on the rule book and doing blind play tests. I think I mentioned before we had one play test that went really well. We got a lot of good feedback from it. And now we're working on getting a couple more set up. One of the big things we've been doing is trying out different rule sets and trying to see which rule book is going to work best. We had one rule set that we tried for the blind play test, and that went pretty well. We had a lot of good feedback from it, but ultimately it didn't. It needed some work. I revised. I thought the new version was great, but I think that it does need some more work still. We had I put the rulebook up for some rulebook exchanges where I read someone else's rulebooks and make a bunch of comments, and then they read my rulebook, make a bunch of comments. So I wanted to talk today about some of that process. Now, if you're not a game designer, hopefully this will still be interesting to you. If you are a game designer, hopefully it won't sound stupid. I wouldn't say I'm a very mature game designer, at least in terms of my abilities. I'm still relatively new to the hobby, or the profession. Hobby, really. We all can see where this is going. But hopefully, well-received hobby. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about the process of interpolating the feedback, meaning getting the feedback, integrating it into my thinking, having an effect the way that we're proceeding, but also the process of not listening to feedback, which is equally important in some ways. So I wanted to talk about a couple things. It's very windy here, but I got to open my notebook. Oh, there we go. So there are three things about the rule book that I wanted to mention that come from comments given in this most recent reading. And on the off chance that the person who made these comments is listening, this is entirely about my reaction to your comments and not at all about the quality of your comments. I think they're great, and I appreciate the opportunity to use them in my thinking as I work forward on my rule book. So the first comment had to do with words the reader doesn't know. And this has always been a sticking point for me, I guess, as I hate to say this without sounding braggy, but if ever there's a time I get to be conceited, it's when it comes to the English language and the written word. As somebody who's pretty well read and a decent writer, at least somebody who can put together sentences and make them say something. I mean, I have published a book and several articles, and I do professionally for a living teach people how to write or teach people to be better at writing and rhetoric. I have a PhD in English. I guess I'm done with my bona fides there. So I feel like the written word is really important to me, and so how I tackle the written word with a rule book is really important. But it also is very humbling because I'll write what I think is a great rule book, and then people can't learn the game from it. And it really does signal what a different skill this particular brand of technical writing is. And so, as with all good scholars, I'm happy to take any feedback I get from people as they're looking at my rule books or helping me figure out what makes them work or not. In particular, feedback number one had to do with words the reader didn't understand. And I think part of it was that the reader does not, the way he put it, he said he doesn't know anything about trains. And the rule book felt like he should. It felt like it assumed he did, which is probably a fair cop. I think in making a game about the elevated train system in Chicago, we assume at some level you understand how trains work and what trains are. And this person has basically said it assumes too much. In particular, one of the things we have in our game is syndicate cards that indicate which train line you work for. And we kind of use syndicate and line interchangeably in ways that was confusing to him. And so I've tried to go back and articulate a bit more the idea that a line is the different company of the train, company that is making the trains, and so give line a bit more context in the way I use it. But he had a couple other words that he called jargon that I had to wrestle with whether to use them or not. One of them was kickback. Highlighted the word kickback and said probably better not to use jargon. And so part of me, this is where I run into problems as snooty pants English professor. Kickback isn't jargon, that's a common word. And this is something I wrestle with when I'm looking at rule books and I have a commenter say, well, that's a word I don't know. And then I wrestle with the eternal question, which is, do I make the language in my rule book simpler in order to make it as accessible as possible to the reader, which the answer should probably be yes, or do I use the best word I can with the potential that the reader may have to encounter words they don't know or look them up? Generally, I err on the side of making language simpler because ultimately I want people to play my game. I don't want people to put down the rule book because they're annoyed that it uses words they don't know. But it's interesting to find what words readers say they don't know and think about what words should or shouldn't meet that hump. In particular, there was a rule book I was reading recently of someone else's, or actually it was somebody who offers their technical guidance in helping people write rule books, and he had a website. And I've thought of that as something that would be interesting to do on the side. I'd really need to think about how I want to market myself in that regard. Because one, I don't know that I can say I have enough experience in rulebook writing to really make the claim that I'd be helpful. I have had several people who appreciated my help. One game in particular includes me in their list of rulebook readers because I helped enough, I guess. But he might have included everybody who helped, in which case that doesn't mean my help was much help. But this particular person, in one of their sample rule books, used the word orthogonal, which is a word that means next to either horizontally or vertically, but not diagonally. It's actually the opposite of diagonal. So when you think about diagonal, it means up and to the right or down and to the right, up and to the left or down to the left. It means next to, on the corners of the 8 squares around a particular square. And orthogonal means next to directly, horizontally or vertically. And that's difficult to explain. It's a really useful word though. Once you know the word orthogonal, it's far easier to give movement instructions to say this piece can only move one space and may only move orthogonally. Boom! You've just collapsed what was probably a whole sentence or maybe 2 sentences into a single word. So the more we use the word orthogonal, the better. And if you're writing a rule book where you have to use the word orthogonal, or you have to use that concept more than twice, I would say you should introduce the word orthogonal and just use that from then on. I don't have a problem in challenging the reader to learn one new concept while they're reading. But you do need to define the term. And so that was, in the comment to this person, I said, do you find that orthogonal, see how English professory I ask it, do you find that orthogonal is a common enough word that you don't need to explain it? And he said, no, you need to explain it. I'm like, well, you didn't on this page. He says, oh, yikes. But so there's a wrestling to do in rulebook writing with what language to use and how elitist you think the language should be. Another place where that comes up is when you're starting off a rulebook and you're describing a mechanism. Like there was a rulebook I read today where the author was having players draft cards. And they did the right thing in terms of describing how drafting works, but they didn't also use the word drafting. And I would argue you should use the word drafting, say this is a card draft, here's how it works, so that you can perpetuate that term and then make it easier for all of us to continue perpetuating that idea that if you explain to someone this is a card draft, here's how it works, then the next time they encounter a card draft, they have in their head the structure they need to understand how that rule set works. You're clearing the ground for all of us when you make those small concessions to teaching in your rulebook. So another problem, and this is the problem that plagued Cromlech, and I'm not convinced we solved it. It's also a problem that plagues our current game, is what I think of as the chicken and the egg syndrome. A lot of rulebooks that I've read will, in the section where they're talking about the components, they will introduce a thing about how to use the components. They'll talk about what they do. And generally that's seen as a no-no. It's a common thing we want to do as game designers when we're teaching the game. We want to introduce the components and explain what they do. But the problem is when people are looking for components, they just want to make sure they have all the stuff that belongs in the box. And they're not ready to learn what the things do yet because they haven't been given the context of the game. The problem is, sometimes in the context of the game, if you don't know how the components work, you can't figure out what to do. So for instance, in our current In the Loop, the original version of the game had a long section that told what the line cards do and the route cards do before we got to the gameplay. And the critique from the blind playtesters was, this is outside of my experience of playing the game. I don't know why I would want to do these things yet, so the descriptions get in the way. So I rearranged the rulebook and I farmed it out to some readers, anonymous readers, who, to be fair, are not playing the game alongside it. They're just reading the rulebook. And one of their first critiques is like, well, I don't know what a line card is, so I don't know why I would want to play it. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg situation. They can't know how to use the components until you've explained how the game works. And they won't know what to do when they're learning the game if they haven't learned what the components do. So you're kind of stuck either way. Now there's a kind of mixing approach where you give a little bit here and a little bit there, but you also don't want to make it so hard to find where all the answers are. So it's trouble three ways, and not an easy problem to solve. But I'll keep wrestling with it. The current version of it is to move the descriptions of what the components do into the part where we explain the gameplay. My problem with that is that our game has 4 phases, and one of the phases is the phase where you're actually doing the playing, and that's the one that takes all the explaining. So what I wanted to do was explain the 4 phases as a set unit. So you do this, 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 and this. And in phase 2, when you're doing the playing, you have to do something very complicated. Here's where you learn what the complicated thing is. But the players said they wanted the complicated thing explained in the midst of when you're learning about that exists. So, not an ideal setup. So I've yet to crack that nut, but I will keep working on it. As an aside, any listeners who would like to take a crack at reading the rulebook, I would welcome your feedback. I promise I won't complain about you on the next episode. In my next episode, I am going to continue talking about learning rules a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about what you get from a hardcore gamer and what you get from a casual gamer in terms of doing your playtesting. But I'm out of time today, so that's where I'm going to stop. I hope that this has been enjoyable for you. It's a beautiful day, and I hope your day is beautiful as well. If you have comments or concerns, we do have a Board Game Geek Guild, and I've forgotten to look up the number again. This is going to be a running gag. Please do stop in and say hello, or pop me an email, brendan@rattleboxgames.com. In the meantime, thanks for joining me on my walk. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.